Let's talk about Chapter 5. So in Chapter 5, we're looking at human error. It's basically one of the most common things in existence. And we learned that, like our language, like the way we talk, has built-in functions that allow us to correct ourselves when we stumble, when we mess up. We're able to kind of organically apologize for mistakes we make when we speak or when we write or something of that nature, and make corrections. But when we're dealing with actions on websites or with devices that we've made, you don't always have the opportunity to correct your mistakes. And so when you make mistakes on these sorts of things, you can throw everything into kind of a state of chaos, right? When you make the wrong move on a website and click the wrong link, all of a sudden you've fallen down a rabbit hole, and it's difficult to get back. Or if you click the wrong radio button and you hit submit, then it's hard to correct yourself. Or something that maybe some of you have experienced, where you accidentally upload the wrong file to Blackboard for your assignment, and your instructor has it on one submission attempt, so now you can't send in another submission. So that makes life difficult and chaotic and a little crazy. So the most common types of errors that happen are slips. And slips are when we intend to do one thing and accidentally do another. So, you might have been, say, reaching for a cup to pick it up, to drink out of it, but maybe accidentally having your hand in the wrong place, you knock it over and spill it. That's a slip. And there are different types of slips, so let's look at a few of them. So capture errors. Capture errors are when you have two action sequences, when there are two things that you can do that have common initial stages. So then you have an alternative action or the wrong action that sort of captures your user's attention and draws it away from what they're supposed to do. So you get distracted. So if we can keep distractions at a minimum and keep our actions unique, then we can kind of avoid capture errors. Description errors. So you have two objects that kind of look alike, but then they're not. So if you have two buttons side by side that on your website, and one of them says submit and one of them says cancel, but they both otherwise look exactly the same, then your user could click cancel when they meant to click submit, or vice versa. And then, maybe a form that they spent a while filling out and making sure they had all the correct information into gets canceled and thrown away. So your signifiers and your affordances are off. And that's frustrating. If you've ever done that, that's frustrating. If you've ever filled out a whole form and then accidentally clicked cancel, that's frustrating. That's going to drive your user away. Data-driven errors. And data-driven errors are more on the user, but it's on us to kind of help our users in this sort of way, because we're anticipating these errors. So data-driven errors are just when somebody thinks of the wrong piece of information or recalls something incorrectly. So like if you confuse two different numbers, when you're entering them into a form. A good way for us to help combat that as web designers is that we can take and try to remind our users of certain things as we're having them do stuff. So if we need specific data, you can let them know where it's found, or you can remind them of it, or go ahead and just try to pre-fill it if you're able, right? Associative activation errors. And this is when you have an event or some kind of action that elicits a response, but it's the wrong response, or it's not the response that you intended. So this is where knowledge in the world and your intentions butt heads and cause a slip. So when knowledge in the world dictates one thing, so we talked about web patterns, so if web patterns dictate that things should be done in a certain manner, and you set up an action that appears to be like this web pattern, but is slightly different and does a slightly different thing, when that user tries to interact with it in the way that they would be accustomed, so in the way that the knowledge in the world has educated them, then it's gonna cause this slip. And so the user is going to think they're doing the right thing, but then they're going to get the wrong response. And that's bad. Clearly. So you want to try to stay with the web patterns. You want to try to stay with the knowledge in the world in order to minimize the impact of this. Loss of activation errors. So this is forgetting to do something, or forgetting part of the act. And this is where reminders can come back into play. Reminding your user, hey, you forgot to check this checkbox before you submit. That could save you some headache on the back end, because if they needed to check this checkbox to agree with the terms and conditions and they forget to do it and they click submit, and it just goes off, then either their application will be rejected and sent back to them, which will be frustrating for them, or it'll get processed and then they won't have checked that they agree to the terms and conditions, which could have legal ramifications. So you want to make sure that the users are remembering the critical steps of what they have to do. So, providing little reminders and not allowing the user to continue until they do these critical steps, it's important. And finally, the last of our slips is a mode error. And this is when devices have multiple modes or actions and you're in the wrong mode. So this is more for product design than it is for web design, but you can think of it in relation to like app design, which is tangentially related. So, if we have a camera app, if we've made a camera app for a cell phone, and it has a video mode and it has a photo mode. Well, if we put video settings on the photo mode side of the app, then the user is going to be confused because they're going to be changing these settings and expecting them to do something, but they're not going to do anything. And then if and when they switch to video mode, their video mode will be incredibly wonky because they'll have changed all these video settings in the other mode. So we want to try to compartmentalize our designs in that sort of way and make sure that if we're designing a website that has different features or designing an app with different modes, We want to keep the different actions for the different features or the different settings or the different modes in their own compartments to minimize these mode errors. So how do we give users a chance to fix their mistakes? Because we can. We said, that artificial devices don't often give us a chance to fix our mistakes, but we can actually build those in. And it's by anticipating mistakes, so anticipating these slips, being proactive in designing for them, and giving your user feedback. Feedback is critical for allowing users to fix their mistakes. The most common feedback element you'd see in this regard when you're designing a website are the call-outs when you've not entered in information into a certain text box that is required on like a form, or you're making a new password for something that doesn't meet the minimum password requirements. So you get that immediate feedback of, this doesn't meet the password requirements, or you forgot to check this box, or you forgot to fill this part out, or you put letters in here and then we were expecting a phone number, or that sort of thing. So if you can anticipate user error, if you can anticipate user slips, and then give the user immediate feedback regarding their slips, that gives the user an opportunity to fix their mistakes, which is not something we get often. And it might be momentarily frustrating for the user, but it's going to be a lot less frustrating to be given the opportunity to fix their mistakes up front and go ahead and fix them quickly than it would be to submit a form that had mistakes or do something that was full of mistakes and end up doing the wrong thing or having a form rejected or something of that nature that's going to cause a larger time investment and a bigger headache. So we want to try to give our users feedback at every opportunity. And we do this, like as I said, by anticipating actions. And so one way that we can anticipate actions even further is we can limit choices. And how we limit our choices, or whether or not we decide to limit our choices, comes up within the deep and narrow versus shallow and wide debate. So, when we talked about creating a user survey, we wanted our user questions to be specific and to give the user a minimal amount of responses so that we could get the best data possible. Because if we can get good data, then we can go back and get better responses later if we have to, or more thorough responses later if we have to. But having these minimal responses allows us to kind of narrow down on what we think could be a problem or what we are facing when we're working on a design. It's kind of like science in that sort of way. You have a hypothesis and you're kind of testing your hypothesis and seeing where it goes. If the task is shallow, width is acceptable. So if you go into an ice cream parlor, you're selecting an ice cream that you're going to enjoy. The ice cream parlor can have a bunch of flavors. They can give you a lot of choice. Because this is a relatively shallow task. It doesn't really Doesn't really matter what kind of ice cream you choose. You know, if you choose it and you hate it, worst case scenarios, you're out like three or $4. You know, and then you can get another one, or your ice cream parlor might even let you do taste tests so you can make sure you like it before you buy it. And it's not a real, like, you know, it's just for one person. The impact of this decision is very low. So you can give a lot of choice. Because, you know, the result of any error, that's going to be absolutely minimal. Minimal to nothing. But if the task is narrow, if it's specific, you know, if you have to have certain things, then depth is acceptable. And so in this case, we're looking at something like a recipe. And like the example photo here talks about baking a sponge cake. Like in order to follow a recipe, especially to bake a cake, you have to follow the instructions to the letter. You can't really deviate, or what you'll end up with won't be a cake. So this is a very narrow task, baking a cake. You know, you kind of have to focus in on what you're doing. You know, it's all prescribed, or else you won't have it. So in this regard, depth is acceptable. If the task is narrow, so if things have to be done in order for it to turn out, and if things are not done properly, then everything gets kind of broken, it's okay to kind of lay out all of the instructions, give every piece of information that the user needs up front, and force them to follow these instructions. Because you want to ensure that everything is done right. Because if it isn't, then it's a mess. You know, think about it in terms of what bad could happen. You know, in the first scenario with choosing ice cream, it's low impact. If they get a flavor and they don't particularly like it, worst case scenario, they're out a couple bucks and they can buy another one relatively easily. In the example of baking the cake, if they mess up and make an error and don't follow the instructions properly, then they end up with a mess of something that doesn't even resemble a cake. And not only that, but they're out the money of all the ingredients that they put into the cake. All of those ingredients are ruined. So there's a bigger impact there. All the time, all the energy, all the effort, all the money, and then just the general, you know, the cleanup, the time afterwards. You can kind of see, even in these two simple examples here, how the consequences can kind of dictate the number of choices that we can give a user. So overall, kind of in conclusion here, design should allow for human error. It's sort of been a theme that we've kind of been making throughout this video. So how can we do this? First thing we should do, we should understand the cause. So if errors are being made, Or if errors can be made, we need to understand how errors are made so that we can fix them or mitigate them. Make it possible to undo them. So give your users an option to fix things. Give them that feedback. Have them review all of their information before they submit it officially. Give them a second chance to be able to do the information. Make it easy to discover when an error occurs. So, this goes back to that form. When you see that form and you have an error in a form, some good forms will highlight the form field in red and throw a big error there like, oh, you didn't fill this out properly. And it'll gain focus and it'll draw your attention to it. So then beyond a shadow of a doubt that an error has occurred. And then tasks are rough approximations of what the user wants to do. So this all goes back to human-centered design. It's the whole overarching theme of the book. If the tasks that you develop are roughly what the user wants to do anyway, then there will be less place for errors to occur. Simply because it's intuitive, they are expecting it, they know what they're doing. And so human errors are diminished. And that's the end of my covering of Chapter 5. In Chapter 6, we'll look at the challenge of design. Thank you for watching.